Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also, call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, getting updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the advisories that we have out for the state. Both are wind advisories for the Alaska Range, and these are in effect from basically the Denali area to the east along the Alaska Range, specifically through the passes. Now, in these areas, we're going to have southerly winds 25 to 35 miles per hour with gusts up to as high as 60 miles per hour, and these are out in effect until 11 p.m. this evening on Wednesday, or on Thursday rather. Taking a look now at the Delta River, an update for you. We're continuing mitigation efforts along the Delta River from AKwx, and you can see that in the image there, some of the heavy equipment out there trying to rebuild and restructure the river. Maintenance crews have diverted water from the road by placing riprap and establishing diversion channels at the material sites south of Spangler Road. That has reduced the amount of water on the road, and they are monitoring the situation and looking into more permanent solutions. As of this morning time, there was less than 1 foot of water around or over the road. Looking to the southeast now, we'll start with the Glacier Dam release on the Salmon River near Hyder. This has likely begun, or the release is likely to have happened. This is going to result in river levels that could rise up to as high as 7 feet. This is going to happen over long duration. It's going to be in the next 3 to 4 days. If you're near the river, be mindful of that. There could be debris and increased riverbank erosion. So if you're in the area of the Salmon River, especially near Hyder, be mindful that the Glacier Dam release is expected to have happened, and we are expecting water levels to rise up to as high as 7 feet. In other news for the southeast, we are going to experience some record high or near record high temperatures, especially in the northern locations. If you notice when we look at Haines and Juneau on this image, they're going to both get up to around 80 degrees on Thursday and Friday. However, places further to the south are going to be a little bit cooler. That's because we're expecting more cloud cover for the central and southern locations of the Panhandle. However, getting up to the Juneau area and further north, we are expecting it to be a little bit more cloud-free, resulting in the availability for temperatures to rise higher, getting up to around 80 degrees again for Haines and Juneau Thursday and Friday, with the warmer day for other locations going to be on Thursday afternoon. Sitka and Petersburg getting up to 75 degrees, Ketchikan up to 79, but then in the lower to mid 70s on Friday for those locations. Taking a look now at our fire danger. Still an area of high fire danger in the Yukon Flats area. The Copper River Basin is going to be the highest impact, with high fire danger throughout much of the basin, and then extreme danger right along the Copper River up to the Glen Allen area. We also have areas of high fire danger around northern portions of Cook Inlet, northern parts of the Kenai, Anchorage Bowl area, including Eagle River, then out by the Palmer area as well. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, we'll start with a low that's near the central Bering Sea that has a front pushing through the eastern Aleutian Islands and then moving into the Alaska Peninsula. And as we watch this again, note ahead of that we have an old system that has started to diminish, now resulting in a deformation zone out over the Kodiak Island area, extending up into the southern mainland, resulting in some rain for those locations, but not expecting a lot of movement as it is just a deformation zone at this time. As you look up further to the north, we can see just to the north of the Arctic coastline, a cold front pushing in that's bringing in some cloud cover and rain to the area, with a mix of rain and snow behind that with that colder air. And then finally out by the western Aleutian Islands, we have a couple different waves moving through the area. You can see one approaching from the North Pacific with more cloud cover headed towards the western Aleutians. It's going to continue to move in over the next couple days. As you look at the weather for the remainder of the today, we can see the warm front approaching the central and western Aleutian Islands from the south, bringing rain with it with that warmer air. And we still have some lingering rain out over the central and western Aleutians from a trough that has been pushing through the area. And then as we look out over the eastern portion of the Bering Sea, we can see our low pressure system by Nunavik Island now, with its front pushing into southwest Alaska, extending out over the Alaska Peninsula, bringing rain to all these areas, and then as far east as Kodiak Island. Then with that southerly flow, we're going to see rain extending up through the western interior, all the way up the west coast into the Brooks Range and the Arctic coastline. And as we get by the Norton Sound area, that rain is going to mix with fog, and then we're going to have that rain and fog mix all the way up the rest of the west coast and Arctic coastline. High pressures dominating the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska, keeping south central Alaska, eastern locations of the interior, and the panhandle dry for the time being. As we move into tonight, that high is starting to push off to the east, but still enough of an impact to keep the panhandle area, south central Alaska, and eastern locations of the interior relatively dry. However, some of that rain is sneaking into southern portions of the Kenai Peninsula from our low that has now anchored itself by Nunavik Island, continuing to bring rain to the Alaska Peninsula, up through southwest Alaska, the west coast, western interior, Brooks Range, and Arctic coastline, where we're starting to see impacts from that cold front moving into the Arctic coastline as well, with some of the locations up by Utqiagvik and Wainwright going to see the potential for a rain and snow mix tonight. We're also going to see fog along the Arctic coastline that extends down the west coast into the Norton Sound area. Behind the low that we have out over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, we have our trough pushing into the western Bering with a frontal system moving in behind it, bringing up a lot of moisture with those two systems and bringing in rain to the central and western Aleutian Islands. As we move into Friday, the one low has anchored itself to the west of the western Aleutians, and the other low has moved into the central Aleutian Islands with its front pushing through the rest of the central Aleutians, bringing more rain to these locations. Our other low that's still going to be anchored right by the southwest coastline by Nunavik Island, continuing to bring rain through the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, western half of the state, including the west coast, up through the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. We're going to still continue to see fog mixing with that rain in areas around the Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, up the west coast, and along the Arctic coastline. However, as we drop down into the southern locations of the interior, central and eastern places are going to be remaining dry. However, rain has now pushed into much of the coastline of south central Alaska, including Prince William Sound. But as we move down into the panhandle, still enough ridging from high pressure to the southeast, keeping rain at bay for now. As we move into Saturday, however, that rain is going to have pushed from the south into the panhandle area, bringing widespread rain to the area, and then all along the North Gulf Coast as low pressure sits out over the Gulf of Alaska. We're going to have rain throughout south central, down into southwest, and then another low out over the eastern interior is allowing for enough instability to see the potential for afternoon and evening thunderstorms for the central and eastern portions of the interior. Showers will be further west out to the west coast, and we'll have some rain showers up in the Brooks Range as well, with some lighter rain up along the Arctic coastline. We'll additionally have a low pressure system that has moved out in the western portion of the Bering that was with our frontal system before. As that front has broken down, we're still going to see rain from this system extending as far east as the Pribilof Islands throughout all of the Aleutians and northern portions of the Bering Sea. Taking a look at our temperatures, starting with our low temps Friday morning out over the Aleutian Islands, temps will drop down into the mid-40s, lower 50s for the Pribilof Islands, and right around 50 degrees for much of southwest Alaska. We're going to get into the lower 50s as we get to the western interior, mid-50s as we push further east in the interior. Up in the Kotzebue Sound area, lower 40s, with the exception of Kotzebue that'll stay a little bit warmer at 52 degrees. Up along the western portions of the Arctic coast, temperatures dropping down to the mid to upper 30s, and then in the mid-40s for eastern locations of the North Slope. Down in south central Alaska, temperatures dropping down to around 50 degrees. Anchorage will actually stay a little bit warmer at 54 degrees, and 54 for Kodiak as well. Then down in the Panhandle, temperatures dropping down to the lower to mid-50s. So we move into Friday afternoon, we are going to see those temperatures rise again with the lower temperatures down in the southern locations. And as we saw earlier, we're going to have the highest temperatures from Juneau north into the Haines and Skagway areas, getting up right around 80 degrees. Then we'll have temperatures in the south central area in the mid to upper 60s, with the interior locations getting warmer into the 70s there. 70s throughout much of the interior, especially in those eastern locations where we'll see temperatures getting up to around 80 degrees. And then the western locations in the mid-60s. Up along the Arctic coastline, eastern locations into the 50s, whereas western locations into the 40s. In the 40s for much of the Kotzebue Sound area. Again, Kotzebue is going to be a little warmer at 56 degrees. Southwest Alaska is going to see temperatures in the 50s to right around 60 degrees, with mid 50s for the Alaska Peninsula and lower 50s for much of the Aleutian Islands, with St. Paul getting up to 52 degrees. Saturday morning low temperatures staying out by the Pribilof Islands right around 50 degrees, into the mid to upper 40s for the Aleutian Islands, right around 50 degrees for the Alaska Peninsula, mid 40s to right around 50 degrees for Southwest Alaska, lower 50s for the western interior, getting up into the mid 50s as we get into the eastern portions of the interior, in the 40s around the Seward Peninsula, and then in the 30s for the western portions of the Arctic coastline, and right around 40 degrees for areas like Deadhorse and further to the west, or to the east rather. Down in the south central area, dropping down into the lower to mid 50s, and then in the Panhandle area, mid to upper 50s, with the exception of Haines getting down to 61 degrees. Saturday afternoon, staying in the Panhandle area, temperatures getting up into the 60s for most locations, some closer towards the Gulf, only getting up into the upper 50s. And then for south central Alaska, lower 60s to mid 60s, in the lower to mid 70s for central and eastern interior, 60s for the western interior and down through southwest Alaska, into the 40s for Kotzebue Sound area. Kotzebue again going to get warmer, 58 degrees expected. 40s for much of the Arctic coastline. AKwx staying a little bit cooler at 38. Alaska Peninsula right around 60 degrees. And lower to mid 50s for the Aleutian Islands, with St. Paul getting up to 59 degrees Saturday afternoon.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Friday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have widespread IFR conditions that are pushing into the southwest coastline as well, and down to the southeast of the area down into Kodiak Island. IFR conditions are also going to extend up the west coast to much of the Seward Peninsula and western portions of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. MVFR conditions are also going to extend further in, covering the remaining portion of the Brooks Range, much of the western portions of mainland Alaska, and down to the Alaska Range as well. However, central and eastern portions of the interior should remain VFR, as well as much of south central Alaska. MVFR and IFR conditions will sit over the Gulf of Alaska, but not quite reach a lot of the coastline as we get closer towards the Panhandle area, where the Panhandle is expected to be VFR Friday morning. So moving to Friday afternoon, similar setup for the Panhandle. VFR conditions for most locations, with IFR and MVFR out over the Gulf of Alaska. South central Alaska will be primarily VFR. However, some areas in the southern portion of Kenai Peninsula will see some MVFR conditions, and Kodiak Island will see IFR. Mainland portions of the state and central and eastern locations will be VFR throughout the day, with MVFR conditions as we move further to the west, with IFR conditions along much of the west coast and along areas of the Arctic coastline as well. Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands should be primarily IFR for Friday afternoon. Saturday morning, continuing to see IFR conditions out through the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, with those IFR conditions once again extending into southwestern portions of the state, and some areas up the west coast as well, to include the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island. Western portions of the Brooks Range, MVFR and IFR conditions are expected, with IFR conditions along the Arctic coast. Much of the rest of mainland for the central and eastern portions of the interior, down into much of south central, should be primarily VFR conditions. And down in the Panhandle area, primarily VFR there as well, with some areas in the very southern areas going to see some IFR and MVFR. For Saturday afternoon, MVFR conditions spreading out through much of the Panhandle area, with the exception of the locations very far to the north in Lynn Canal, and IFR conditions for the Yakutat area, as well as much of the North Gulf Coast to the Kenai Peninsula area. MVFR conditions starting to sneak their way into much of south central Alaska and portions of the interior, as well as up along the Arctic coastline, where we'll see some MVFR and IFR conditions. MVFR down all of the west coast of the state, and then widespread IFR for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at our passes, AKwx will start off IFR, improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan will start off marginal and then also improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill will both start off MVFR, improving to VFR. Rainy Pass will start off MVFR, improving to VFR. Windy will also be MVFR, improving to VFR in the afternoon. Isabel Pass should be VFR throughout the day on Friday, as well as at Mentasta Pass and down at Tanita Pass. Portage 2 will be VFR throughout the day on Friday, and Chilkoot and White should both also be VFR all day on Friday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, main thing to note is the tongue of colder air extending on the west coast of the state, with those 6,000-foot freezing levels down into southwest Alaska and down by the Alaska Peninsula. Some warmer air is further to the west out over the central and western Aleutian Islands. For our icing, in the same area where we saw the cold air dipping down the west coast of the state, we're going to see some icing doing the same down in our trough. Above 8,000 feet in those southern locations around the Bristol Bay area, above 7,000 feet by the Norton Sound area, and then above 7,000 feet as we get up to the western portions of the Arctic coastline. Taking a look at our jet for Friday, one branch of the jet is moving in over the Aleutian Islands out of a westerly direction up to as high as 100 knots for the central and eastern Aleutians. Over mainland Alaska, primarily seeing southerly flow, 70 knots in southern locations, getting up to as high as 85 knots along the Arctic coastline, and then 50 knots out of a southeasterly direction out over the Panhandle. As we move down to 9,000 feet, continuing to see southeasterly directions over the Panhandle, 35 knots, getting up to as high as 45 knots out over the Gulf, southerly winds over the mainland, up to as high as 40 knots in the western interior, and then southwesterly winds along the Arctic coast around 40 knots. Strongest portion of winds for 9,000 feet is going to be just to the south of the central Aleutian Islands out of a westerly direction up to as high as 65 knots, with 35 knots as we get closer towards the islands. Down to 3,000 feet, similarly we have our strongest winds out of the west south of the central Aleutians up to as high as 60 knots, out over the western Aleutians southerly winds up to as high as 35 knots, and then northwesterly winds over the Alaska Peninsula at around 25 knots. Strongest winds over the mainland are going to be over southwest Alaska, moving up into the Galena area out of a southerly direction, 35 knots. The rest of the mainland should be fairly weak until we get by the Kaktovik area, southwesterly winds 30 knots, and weak winds over the Panhandle. For our turbulence, out over the Brooks Range below 5,000 feet, southwest Alaska below 5,000 feet. Then for the central Aleutians, below 3,000 feet is expected there.
Aloha, stargazers. Trace here. Right now, we have 88 formally recognized constellations in our night sky across both hemispheres, but there are others up there too, and an easy one to find is Maui's fishhook. Face south this week and you'll see Scorpius the scorpion, and yet many people see this J-shaped pattern as the giant fishhook of the demigod Maui. In Polynesian folklore, Maui and his brothers decided to go fishing. He brought his magic fishhook with him and instructed his brothers that once he tossed the fishhook in the water, no matter what they caught, to keep paddling and not look back. Many hours later, the exhausted humans looked and saw land. Maui had pulled land up from below the sea, the Hawaiian Islands. Now we can see Maui's fishhook in the sky every summer. What can I say except you're welcome, and keep looking up.
If you've been watching this series, you know that NASA has scientists posted all over the world studying Earth's frozen regions. We've got people exploring ice sheets, glaciers, permafrost, sea ice, snow, and even ice on other planets. But even our top scientists need a little backup sometimes.
Do you like going outside to do science?
Yeah,
Why?
because it's fun.
Yeah. What's your favorite part?
Frost tube.
Frost tube! Cool!
In this bonus episode of Cryosphere, we're following the micro explorers that are helping NASA collect data from their own backyard.
Do you think it's going to be frozen?
Yeah.
Yes? Why?
Because it's very frozen!
Here's the idea. Students construct a frost tube that gets put into a hole in undisturbed and uncompacted soil. During the cold months, students will measure the depth at which water in the frost tube freezes, indicating that the surrounding soil has frozen. This is one of many citizen science projects facilitated by GLOBE, the Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment program.
What's going on? What did you find out?
It's ice!
How far down is the ice? So is there still liquid in there?
It's a worldwide program that, so far, has collected over 130 million measurements from more than 10 million students in 113 countries.
Are you scientists?
Yeah.
These measurements are added to a massive worldwide database that's free and open to the public.
GLOBE connects my students with the rest of the world through science and looking at climate change and how it's affecting the future.
Globe teachers like Terry are transforming the way kids see science and how they'll respond to changes in their future environment.
Let me see your happy face. Ah!
Actually, we were so impressed with the kids of John Fredson's school that we decided to show their work to the scientists in the original NASA Explorers Cryosphere series. And they had a couple things to say.
Oh my god, that's awesome.
Oh my god.
Do you like going outside to do science? Why? How far down is the ice?
That's awesome.
Wow, this is really, really cool.
Hey students from Miss Terry's class, I just got to see your video. I was so impressed that you guys were braving the conditions of the snow and all the crazy stuff to go and learn more about the permafrost and where the water layer is right outside your school. That looked incredible.
It is so exciting to see you guys and girls doing such great work as we watch our planet change over time.
Hey there, young scientists. Looks like you guys are doing some amazing things. Remember to keep warm and take notes, and also stay curious.
Oh my god, this is awesome. I love seeing the enthusiasm of these kids. They're outside, it's obviously really cold, but everyone is so excited to be out there making measurements for NASA. That's wicked cool.
Because you're so right, science is so fun, and I really hope that you'll continue believing in that. The best piece of advice I ever got was, whatever you do, do your best.
And from all of us here at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, remember, dare mighty things.
So keep up the great work. Make sure that you're having fun no matter what. That's the key thing about pursuing a career in science. Make sure it's something that you love. And I'm really impressed. So hopefully we'll take the lessons you're learning and apply them when we explore our solar system.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. If you note, around the Beaufort Sea area, we do still have a fair amount of ice in the area, especially just off the coastline there. And some of that is multi-year ice that is allowing for a slower breakup for the area than we had the last several years. However, over the long period, it is still faster than the averages when we look back the last 30 years or so. As we look into Friday for southeast Alaska, we have variable winds out over the Gulf around 10 knots, and then the inside waters, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots, until we get up into the northern portion of the inside waters by Lynn Canal, where we have northerly winds around 15 knots there. Into Saturday, we have southerly winds in the inside waters 15 to 20 knots, and out over the Gulf of Alaska, southeast winds 25 knots with seas up to as high as 10 feet in the northern portions of the Gulf. On Friday for south central Alaska, we have northerly winds over the northern portions of the Gulf and into Prince William Sound around 10 knots, becoming easterly as we get closer towards the Barren Islands and around 15 knots with 20 knots on the western side of the Barren Islands. In Cook Inlet, northerly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected. Then on Saturday, north to east winds in Cook Inlet around 10 knots. Then northwest winds 15 knots west of the Barren Islands, becoming northeast 15 to 20 knots east of the Barren Islands. Northern portions of the Gulf, easterly winds 25 knots, and east 20 as we get into Prince William Sound. Seas as high as 10 feet, highest in the northern portions of the Gulf. For Friday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, in Shelikof Strait, easterly winds 15 knots. On the east side of the island, northwesterly winds 10 knots there. Northeasterly winds 15 knots east of Chignik. And then west to northwest winds as we get closer towards Sand Point and Cold Bay at around 20 knots. And then in Bristol Bay, southerly winds 10 knots are expected. On Saturday, lighter winds around 10 to 15 knots most locations, strongest at around 15 knots to the south and east of Kodiak Island out of a west to northwest direction. Otherwise relatively variable with the light 10 knot winds. For Friday for the Aleutian Islands, starting off in the eastern Aleutians, westerly winds 15 to 20 knots are expected, 10 to 15 knots as we move further to the west, and then switching to become southeasterly by the central Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots, and 20 knots out of that southeast direction by the western Aleutian Islands. Seas up to as high as 6 feet. Then on Saturday, winds picking up quite a bit, especially for the western Aleutians. Southwest winds 30 knots with seas up to as high as 12 feet, 25 knots out of the southwest for the central Aleutians, and then southerly winds for the eastern Aleutian Islands 15 to 20 knots. Along the west coast for Friday in the Norton Sound area, southeast winds 10 knots. By St. Lawrence Island, northerly winds 20 knots. Around Nunavik Island, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots. St. Matthew Island, northerly winds 15 knots. And the Pribilof Islands, westerly winds 20 knots. On Saturday, we're going to have southerly winds by the Pribilof Islands around 20 knots. Becoming easterly, 25 knots by St. Matthew Island. Around Nunavik Island, westerly winds 10 knots. Becoming northerly, 20 knots by St. Lawrence Island. And then in the Norton Sound area, northeasterly winds 10 knots are expected. Along the Arctic coastline, we have northerly winds 10 knots, staying northerly rather, as we move down the west coast of the state. Up by Point Lay, around 10 knots, picking up to 15, and then 20 knots through the Bering Strait area. For Saturday, continuing to see northerly to northeast winds along the west coast, 20 knots, and then along the Arctic coastline, 15 knots. For a recap of weather, starting with tonight, out over the western Aleutians, we have two different systems moving through, a trough that's pushing into the Bering, and then a warm front coming in from the North Pacific, bringing rain to the central and western Aleutian Islands. We have a low that is now settled in by Nunavik Island, continuing to bring rain for the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, through southwest Alaska, up through the west coast and western mainland, into the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. We also have fog mixing with the rain for the Norton Sound area, up the rest of the west coast, and through the Arctic coastline. Some rain showers for the eastern portions of the Brooks Range, but high pressure out over northwest Canada going to keep south central Alaska, eastern interior, and the Panhandle relatively dry, with the exception of the southern portions of Kenai Peninsula. As we move into Friday, going to have some of that ridging hanging out still over the Panhandle area, but rain is on the way coming from the south, but not quite there on Friday. We'll have some rain along the North Gulf Coast, moving into south central and Prince William Sound, and then continued rain for Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, through the western portions of mainland Alaska to include the west coast and the Arctic coastline due to low pressure that has been settled in by the Nunavik Island area. We'll also have a mixture of fog from the Norton Sound area up the west coast and the Arctic coastline. Then out over the western portions of the Bering Sea, we have a low settling in over the central Aleutians, bringing rain to the central and western Aleutian Islands. For Saturday, low pressure out of the Bering going to bring rain through the Pribilof Islands and the Aleutians, then widespread rain throughout mainland Alaska with the potential for afternoon thunderstorms for central and eastern portions of the interior, with rain also extending down to the Panhandle.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.